Long-term's got to have a good computer because it is a computer program. Remember the stupid thing I wrote on the screen? You had a broken long-term field trim? You had a broken OBD2? It may be stupid, but I'm trying to make points. Stop pretending. Some of this crap we don't know. We just don't know. Go with what you know. Don't you like fix 80% of the cars that show up in your shop without blinking an eye? It's just some redundant, stupid problem. Whether the guy before you fix it or the guy behind you can fix, well, it doesn't matter. 80% of the time we fix these things half asleep. We don't even think. And what kicks our butt is that 80% because then what 15% rolls in, it's a little bit harder. You're going to have to do something extraordinary. Going to have to inference with somebody. Hey, Bob, you ever see this before? That's inferencing. You know. So how many people call I did not fix? Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't fix. Yeah, we're going to inference with something. The trouble is when the car comes in, there's not a big 15% on the door. So if you stop pretending, and what words do you want me to use? If you stop thinking you know, if you stop thinking you understand, if you stop thinking you're better than you are, that would help. That's where I go wrong. I think I can get hung. You ever get hung up on something and you just determine that it is, and you're going to prove that's wrong, and an hour later it ain't? I do that. I am guilty of that. I'm an expert at that because I know I can't be wrong. And then when I prove myself wrong, I go, damn, that's the first time. Today. So the bottom line here is a changing of the injector on time, when, always. Fuel control goes way beyond the correction factor. Fuel control is a factor within the fuel control. It starts with key on, engine off. Don't we set the starting injector pulse width then? And what's that based off of? RPM? Oh, no, there's no RPM. Would map divided by barrel be involved in that? Yeah, okay, so half the basic, but most of the modifiers. What sets the injector pulse width on time at key on, engine off is basically part of the formula. So when we get to the formula is everything. And I know you've heard me just spit that formula out. I remember it. I know it. I will not forget it, because if I forget it, then I'm working on a comeback. You ever get a comeback? Never, Chris? What's worse? I lie too. I'm married, of course I lie. What's worse than a comeback?
Don't leave.
Never leave. Never left. All right? They're just part of fuel control. The bottom line is the injector pulse width, engine RPM divided by maximum engine RPM times manifold absolute pressure divided by barometric pressure is the basic injector squirt. It is it. Now, is it always it? No. At key on, engine off, we don't have RPM. We don't care about the maximum RPM at that time, so we're working with only half of the basic formula. That makes sense? Because it doesn't stop there. The multipliers have to be considered. Remember what they wrote on the board? Don't miss anything. Note, barrel is a factor because of altitude. We talked about that, questions. All right, so the multipliers are, as an example, system voltage. I have, in fact, tried to help people on the phone. I've helped people I'll be standing next to them. We look at the same scan data, and I'll say, do you see anything wrong? They go, no, I told you it was all normal. I said, what's that noise? They go, what do you mean? I don't hear it. I go, no, that noise sounds like the engine's running. They go, it is. I go, and you got like 12.9 battery voltage? Is that right? Without even knowing what the spec is for the, I didn't even give you a specific car, we know that ain't right. The injectors and the coils are electric devices. They don't work so good with less electricity. They work less, all right? So another modifier would be that the engine temperature sensor. How important is that? Very important sometimes. Is it important all the time? Oh, I disagree with you. Well, it's not. After this car warms up and closes loop, it's not important. But before you get there, so don't pretend that you know all about this unless you go, you know what? This thing can fall off at 195 degrees and the car wouldn't know it. You could just set what? An electrical, an open short code. That's all it would set. Wouldn't make the car run, Richard. One of the things I like to do in hands-on class is we'll look at the oxygen sensor and the car's closed, completely closed loop, and we start disconnect sensors. And many technicians are amazed at how during certain engine operating conditions, some sensors just have no effect on this whole thing. And they had been up to that point doing what? Pretending that they knew. Pretending. How about the inlet air temperature? Who? You answer this question with the same word as you used the first time you answered the question, you'll be right. Who puts the highest priority on an IAT?
The time, Ford.
Ford. Ford just thinks the world of those IATs. Bad IAT on a Ford can cause black smoke. I don't know about European and Asian, but no other domestic can do that. All right? We got these nowadays. Did you ever see one of these bad on a Ford? Fuel compensation. If it's E85, it's got a fuel compensation sensor. They go bad at a huge rate on a Ford. I don't know why. Ford's got to have something bad on it, so they chose that. All right? The engine coolant temperature sensor is a major fuel control during any enrichment. Now we're going to add a word. We kind of use different words, but you really want to understand rich and lean conditions, use the word enrichment and stop using other words. Fuel enrichment, cold fuel doesn't vaporize, so we add extra fuel when we start it up. Based off of what? Coolant temperature sensor, right? So when we look at that, the added fuel is based off the coolant temperature sensor, so the coolant temperature, can I buy a vowel? The hell was that? A waste that. Take two. The hell with that. It's a major fuel control sensor when the engine's cold. It's a major fuel control. Now we got to pick a temperature. We're going to pick a standard everyday temperature, and that's 70 degrees Fahrenheit. We can't talk about it. We're not going to pretend that we have the same fuel enrichment at minus 20 as we do plus 20. You can't pretend. Stop it. So we're going to use one standard for this discussion. Bound and determined to call this a class tonight. I don't know why. Maybe it's a bunch of guys staring at me. Unnerving, isn't it? Delivered, the fuel enrichment for cold start is delivered in a short time increase of injector pulse width. Example, at 70 degrees Fahrenheit, you're going to get a 1.1 second of an additional fuel burst. Rich has seen it because we talked about it earlier. Rich was looking at it, and he may or may not know what he was looking at, but he nailed it. And like I said, we're going to talk about it later. If we were looking at a voltage waveform on an injector, what would we see? Would we see it expand and come back quickly enough at startup? Would we? Yes. We got to agree on that now. All right. So, and you know, the truth is, if you're doing current waveform, you're going to see an increase there anyway. All right. So I'm just using the injector waveform here, in voltage rather. Engineers say it this way. We pretended we knew. Stop reading, Chris. We pretended we knew why we had choke, didn't we? Fuel, we said it early on in this segment that cold fuel doesn't vaporize so good. So we're going to add extra fuel. But engineers add that on the injector, that 1.1 squirt injector pulse width increase at 70 degrees Fahrenheit, because the additional fuel delivered during cold engine startup is going to, that extra squirt is going to wet the intake runners, wet the control valves, and wet the cylinders. It's a pipeline. Things in motion tend to remain in motion until acted upon by a force. And my favorite, things at rest tend to remain at rest until your wife comes home. Rich,
Are you going to see those low numbers on a scan tool during cranking
what low numbers?
for injector pulse width? You really going to see that big change there?
Injector pulse within milliseconds.
Millisecond. Yeah, you're going to see a number for the squirt.
Maybe. I am not a Democrat. I'm sorry, I didn't know I was with a liberal crowd. Well, let's go save a tree after class. Let's carry a whale to the ocean so he can fart naturally. Maybe is a true and correct answer. Because if the moon is lined with the sun and the third Earth is aligned, right, if everything's okay, your scan data is going to find that and see it, and that's the scan data that's being produced for the scan tool at that moment. But in the very next time you try to start up, it may... scan data is like this. It's not like this. This is an analogy. Scan data is in a big rotary switch. One of them is, pick one, TPS, sensed voltage, blah, 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 and one of them is IPW. So if you're here when you start it up, it goes, oh, it shows you IPW, so you get to see those crazy numbers. But if you're over here and IPW is over there, you don't get to see them, so maybe. So it's best to do this if you want to see this. Wonder if I'm getting enrichment. Remember, that's a word I'd like you to start using. I wonder if I'm getting enrichment at startup. And remember, that's sort of like the word remember without the RE. So remember that I'm talking simply about 1 degree, 70 degrees Fahrenheit. If it's colder, will it be a longer pulse? If it's hotter, will it be a shorter pulse? You know, we got to have some place to establish that. Does that answer your question satisfactory? All right. So we're filling a pipeline with this wetting. And truth is, things at rest want to remain at rest. So what we're going to do is wet the system through with extra fuel, because when we squirt an injector, where does it squirt to? The back of the intake valve. The intake valve's fillet radii. So it hits that and it splashes. Is the valve open or closed? It's closed. I'm not going to argue with it. It's closed. All right? We got to have it there, so when the valve opens, it's there because things in rest tend to remain at rest, blah, blah, blah. Plus, we want it to hit the back of the fillet radii to do the last little bit of atomization to the fuel. And that's why carbon on the back of the intake valve screws that whole deal up. Some people say, well, carbon acts like a sponge. Oh, bullshit. I'm sorry. That is just a... where do you get that? Let me hit you with a sponge and let me hit you with some carbon. Doesn't act like it doesn't absorb it. It just disrupts it. All right? So, and that's to avoid stalling. God didn't read the last one. That's to avoid stalling. When we talk about fuel enrichment, hot fuel can cause a condition known as vapor lock. So if we add a little bit extra squirt, that's going to cool the fuel, because the fuel that we're going to squirt is a little bit cooler than the hot fuel rail. So we're going to add compensation for that condition, and the added fuel is based on engine temperature. ECT, if on modern cars, a fuel rail temperature sensor, and that's delivered in a short time, shorter than the first one, and that's going to be like a 0.9. If the other one was 1.1 at 70, this burst is going to be at 0.9. So when we look at voltage on an injector waveform, does it go? What's it supposed to? It goes. Right? So you want to record it so you can play back frame by frame so you can see it go this way, come back, and go this way and come back. Now you know you have normal fuel enrichment, and maybe that's why you're not starting up, because you don't have normal fuel enrichment. Questions on it? Questions at all? All right. Moving on. There it is. Is that what I'm talking about? Are you ready for a pop quiz? Good or bad? Is that line there good or bad? Yeah, because what is that line representative of? What part on the car is that represented? What system on the car? Charging system. So it's good. If does this tell me anything about the injector?
Getting voltage. It's got power to it.
Well,
It's got
It tells me that if the injector pulse width is wrong, it's not because of power. So